this is the thing we have to face. You know, you can argue backwards and forwards about whether we're at a technical peak oil. In other words, that in each year from now on, we will produce less oil every year. That's dangerous because the population continues to increase and demands for oil increase. And if we're having less every year, somebody has to do without. When Saudi Arabia says, heck, we're going to produce 8% less a year, we go, oh, that doesn't sound like so much. But in 10 years, that's 80% less. It's got to be made up by something. And what that something is going to be critical to how we go forward as a species, how our governments go forward, and how our economies go forward. So it's not a matter of we won't have oil in the future. The real answer is the easy, cheap oil is gone. I mean, take a look. We're drilling 4 miles beneath the Gulf to try to get to oil, which is incredibly difficult and expensive to do, and probably not technically possible yet, as we saw with the Deepwater Horizon. And why would anyone do that if they could get oil more cheaply somewhere else? Well, one of the few places left to get a little bit of cheap oil is up in Alaska. And even if we tapped all of that overnight, it would only extend the world's supply of oil a handful of months. So it's not significant. But the basic thing people got to realize, even if we had an unlimited amount of oil left, it's the wrong stuff to burn. It's toxic. It adds to our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It kills tens of thousands of people every year in hydrocarbon-related emphysema. In countries around the world where kerosene is used for cooking, it kills millions of women every year who cook indoors over kerosene stoves. The list goes on and on about the toxicity of oil. And we have to pretend that it's okay to even have a discussion that oil is a default fuel. It's a fuel that has to stop being produced, whether it's from oil sands, tar sands, oil shale, or from coal. Those all have to go away. And the only way we'll pay for that 150 to 200 barrel oil from the so-called oil from those sources is if there is no alternative. Well, alcohol is made from solar energy. It's not limited the way oil is. Oil, hey, it was made once, there's only so much in the ground, and once it starts getting less and less, it becomes more and more valuable. Shortages, again, in permaculture parlance. So when we're talking about solar energy, well, it's going to be with us for 4.5 billion years, and when the sun burns out, well, we have problems then. But until then, we've got a pretty darn good source of energy. Now, why do I call alcohol solar energy? It's pretty much simple. Solar energy is used by plants to glue together carbon dioxide and water. Plants make carbohydrates. Carbon dioxide, hydrate, water, and the solar energy glues that together. So what are carbohydrates? Well, sugars, starches, and plant fiber. None of those components come from the soil. They come from the atmosphere, and they come from the sun. So there's really no limit to how much of that stuff we can produce over time. Can we produce enough? We can produce many times what humanity needs in terms of all energy we use if we want to produce alcohol from designed crops. And I'm not talking about genetically designed crops, I'm just talking about chosen crops that we can produce for energy and food. And we can do it for $40 a barrel, day in, day out, decades on decades to come. And if you can buy a fuel for $40 a barrel, why would you buy one for $150 a barrel, which is what we're looking at from the alternatives that the oil companies want to bring us. Many of us know the story of Prohibition. Prohibition, a very curious thing, where in a country where women did not have the vote, and an all-male Congress, with the exception of one woman from Wyoming, voted to ban the making of alcohol. But curiously enough, it was only after Rockefeller gave the women's Christian temperance movement $4 million to go and buy Congress to vote for this improbable bill, and crushed alcohol as an alternative fuel in this country, and of course had no effect on people's drinking. There's a long history of deception of the public and duping of the public, and food versus fuel, which is the question you asked, is the most recent version. So the proposition is, if you take the corn that people would eat and make it into alcohol, you've destroyed it, and now people can't eat it. That's preying on our ignorance of agriculture in the United States, because 90% of the corn that we grow in the United States is fed to cattle, not even fed to people. Of what remains, over 5% is made into high fructose corn syrup, which I would argue is not food. 3% is made into modified food starch, which is, what stiffened up this shirt at the laundry, or they also make gunpowder with it, and they put it into salsas that are from New York City and not from the Southwest to thicken things up, right? And so it's an industrial product also. There is one other thing there's two things that we use for food from corn. One is breakfast cereal and corn chips. That's 1% of the total corn that we grow. And 1% of the corn we grow, we make into whiskey, which I always do argue is food. But other than that, really everything we grow in the United States is fed to animals. Now, some of you out there might not be vegetarians, and you'd say, meat is food, so that's valid. But it takes 10 pounds of corn to make 1 pound of cow. Well, if you took that 10 pounds of corn and sent that to Africa, instead of feeding it to the cow, you'd keep those 10 people alive for a day instead of feeding one cow, which makes 9/10 of it into manure. Why are cows so wasteful? Well, in permaculture, we always look to where something began and when something began. And so in the case of cows, they came from the forests of southern Europe and northern Africa. Forests in northern Africa, get that as a concept. Well, we have the Sahara Desert now. And they ate woody brush. Cattle aren't even adapted, actually, to eat grass. So here we are feeding them corn, the seeds of grass, and guess what? They can't get food value out of the starch. It goes through undigested. But starch, wow, that's what we're making alcohol from. So if we make the alcohol first and take the starch out of the corn, which is right now a surplus going to waste in feedlots, and then feed what's left over from making alcohol to the cows, guess what? They actually gain more weight than if they would have eaten the original corn, because the starch inhibits their absorption of nutrients. And believe me, farmers would love to do something different, because being the vassals of Cargill or ConAgra is not a good life. And so saying, well, sure, I can't really risk putting my whole 500 acres into, sorghum, but can I put 100 in and bring you the sorghum for your alcohol production? Absolutely. And next year you can do 200 and 300. And so what that does is it creates a mosaic of crops in the Midwest instead of a biological desert of only 2 crops. And so what does that mean ecologically? It means pests go down. Because when a corn borer comes up out of the ground in the spring and goes, where's my corn? This is a beet. I don't eat beets. You're talking about crop rotation, reducing pest pressure. You're talking about not needing so much chemical fertilizer because you vary crops and they draw on different things. And the byproducts of the small alcohol plant go right back into the field to fertilize those crops. So without even using the O word, you'd be making a transition to organic farming in the Midwest just by doing it with plain old small-scale capitalism. In other words, provide a market for farmers to not have to grow corn and soybeans. That's the promise of what small-scale alcohol could provide. And what's the energy return on that? The energy return is enormous, because when you put back the nutrients from the alcohol plant back into the soil, as the spent mash going back into the soil, you've eliminated all the fertilizer, which is made of fossil fuels. If you go ahead and have a mosaic of crops, you don't need hardly any pesticides. And so now, it's just corn and soybean pests out there, and you've got beets. They don't eat those. So you're in this wonderful position where you don't need to buy Monsanto's, Roundup or, various other pesticides. And so now you don't use that oil product. You're not having to transport it so far to the ConAgra terminal 50, 100 miles away. You're making alcohol right there on the farm, and you can deliver it to a local strip mall with an above-ground station and just deliver it 5 miles, and people in your community can buy that fuel. You've wiped out all the middlemen, and now you're going right to retail. Everybody wishes there were magic bullets to solve all their problems. And pesticides have always been marketed as a silver bullet, but they've been at best kind of a rusty iron bullet, and in general they're kind of a dull bullet that doesn't kill things, and basically they're a bullet that can't even get out of the gun half the time. Why? Because nature is a lot smarter than Monsanto. If you have billions of bugs, and they are thrown at whatever chemical you put in the field. Some of them will survive. Some of them will have the right genetics where they go, wow, DDT, I love that stuff. I eat that for breakfast, you know? And so those are the bugs that survive. Well, they're the ones that are left to breed. And so all the bugs next year are from the parents of the ones that liked DDT. DDT killed all their competition. This is great. They could eat all the corn they wanted. So now, the following year when all the bugs come out, instead of 1% or 2% being resistant to DDT, 20% are, because that's what you selected for by killing all the others. And then by the third generation, it's 80%, and by the fourth generation, it's 100%, and now you have to switch pesticides. And that's been the treadmill farmers have been on ever since World War II, when we started using monstrous amounts of pesticides because we started growing too much of one crop at a time in one place. Places like Mexico, no farmer plants one variety of beans. They'll plant 40 variety of beans. And guess what? A bunch of those varieties of beans won't do well. But something always does well. This year's a drought, well, the dry adapted one does well. This year's too wet, the one that likes water makes it. The dry one didn't make it. It doesn't matter, because when you plant the whole genetic palette of beans, something will work. And when you're depending on that for food, that's more important than getting the maximum yield per acre. But the average Mexican farmer farms permaculturally, and they actually make more money than the corporation in the United States that grows corn with the best of technology. Why? Because in the United States, we grow one crop at a time. In Mexico, no one would think of doing that. That would be a waste of space. So in Mexico, you grow corn, which is the low-cost commodity, but you also grow nice high-protein beans, which climb the corn. So you're using the services of the corn stalk as a scaffold for the beans to grow. The corn uses the ability of beans to trap nitrogen from the air and make fertilizer, and corn needs that nitrogen. And then underneath, in the shade, beneath those two crops, they grow squash. Now, if you add up the total dry weight pounds of food from the corn, from the beans, and the squash, you get at least 50% more food per acre than the best Iowa cornfield with the best technology we can throw at it to grow corn, because each crop uses some more of the sunlight falling on that field instead of only using 30%, which is about the maximum any one crop can use. So we're using all the sunlight filtering through the canopy down to the squash, and all of those things are producing food. That's the way to get the highest amount of food per acre. People think that's what the Green Revolution promised, and it did not. What the Green Revolution promised is the greatest amount of food per acre, the greatest amount of food at the least amount of labor per acre. The idea was to do away with people. People are pesky. You know, if you have a bunch of farmers, they want things like schools and swimming pools and all that kind of infrastructure. If you don't need people because you have, a machine that can plant 5,000 acres of corn and harvest 10,000 acres of corn, and one guy can run it, well, you don't need to have taxes to go to all this infrastructure. So you favor growing this incredibly inefficient crop and sell it for almost nothing because you can do it without labor. Remember, every product in the world is made from three things: energy, capital, and labor. So modern agriculture has adopted the industrial model where you maximize the benefit of capital, million-dollar combines, instead of using labor, instead of using people. And energy is what powers the whole thing. So nature has scales that work. And when it comes to energy, solar energy is the defining moment of scale. So with small-scale alcohol fuel, well, we're looking at, much smaller units than these giant industrial plants that they put up in the Midwest to imitate oil refineries. Those 100 million gallon plants take 45% of the crops from 50 miles in diameter around it. That's nuts. I'll tell you why. Because the corn can get into the plant, but once you mix it with water, make it into mash, ferment it, distill it, now you got all this soup left over. Where's that going to go? You can't dump it out the back door in the local creek. It's too much of a good thing. It's a surplus of nutrients. It's not bad, it's not good, but it's too much to put in a river. That would be pollution. when you put too much of a substance back in an ecosystem without something designed to eat it up, that's surplus, and that can also be pollution, waste, and extra work, which we're very allergic to in permaculture. So if we go ahead with a small-scale plant, we avoid the problems of the large-scale plant. What does the large-scale plant have to do? They have to pour in energy into that liquid to evaporate the water off so that it can be made into a syrup, which can be mixed with the dry grain that's left over and shipped somewhere. But if you're doing it on the small scale, and in other words, on the scale that makes sense, like the 500 or 1,000 acre or 2,000 acre, well, you're immediately adjacent to the land. So you could feed it to cows that live on that land, right? And they can poop out the surplus nutrients and fertilize the next crop you're going to grow on that land. Or you could put that crop, the mash, back on the land, kill the weeds, grow the crop, and not use fertilizer. But you don't have to pour in all this energy to make the liquid dry enough to move somewhere, because you can't ship water anywhere, really. So scale matters. Too big is not better. Smaller is better and more capitalistically cost effective. And the jobs per gallon go way up the smaller the plant. And even David Pimentel agrees with me, that's a good thing. More jobs is a good thing. We're also used to thinking of reduced labor to like the least amount. That's not the best way to run an economy. If you go to any Midwest community where there's an alcohol plant, the bars are open, which may or may not be a good thing. The barber shops are open, the restaurants are open. The kids have better clothes when they go to school. The schools are better funded from taxes. Why? Because that energy cost that would have otherwise gone to an oil company in an OPEC nation, that money now went through the alcohol plant and is circulating through all those salaries, all through the community, and the community is prosperous. And guess what? It's like that everywhere in the world. If you go to Brazil, where there's an alcohol plant, the workers have 10 months of work a year cutting sugar cane around that plant, so they have a sustainable job that isn't a 3-month seasonal farm work job, and everything is financially better for quite a wide radius around the plant, because that money didn't leave the community for some transnational corporation's Geneva bank account. That is probably the most important thing for America to learn from alcohol fuel. The DOE did a great study on what would happen if we had small, medium, and large alcohol plants. Well, we built large ones, but when you put all of those together, it would mean that we'd have 26 million non-exportable jobs in the United States, providing the fuel to run our economy, for our cars, for our electricity, for everything.